Rimmer thought he was at his most unrelaxed when Lister suddenly thrust his hand out of the driver's window and caught a handful of shattered glass, which he distributed around his lap, but Rimmer was wrong. His unrelaxation didn't even peak when Lister screamed, "Heads down!" and ducked towards the steering wheel. Kryton and Rimmer dipped their heads as low as they could. The cat didn't move. Rimmer hissed at him to get down, but he just remained upright and staring forward, oblivious. Rimmer glanced up at the driver's mirror, just in time to see the bearded, genetically challenged, diagonally dentured hillbilly hermit of his nightmares level a smoking rifle at them. With a strange, sucking sound, a bullet tugged itself out of the dashboard and, dragging the tiny shards of glass from the seat beside him in its wake, zipped through the rear window, sealing it neatly. "Stay low," Lister injuncted, quite unnecessarily. The hillbillies scampered up a hillock and out of Rimmer's sight as the truck swept around a bend. Naturally, given Lister's inexcusable insistence on obeying the perverse conventions of this world, the bend would take them round the hillock to where the hermit would be waiting for them, giving him the chance to squeeze off another shot. Sure enough, there was the strange implosion sound again, and the glass on Lister's lap leapt up and formed itself into a driver's door window, which, for some reason, appeared to be misted over and coated in yellowish slime. Then Lister did something for which Rimmer would never forgive him. Lister parked the car. "Lister, what the smeg are you playing at?" Rimmer mezzo-sopranoed. Lister ignored him, bent forward and began fiddling with the steering column. Rimmer looked up and saw the hermit's face press madly against the driver's door window, yelling incomprehensible threats. And Lister stopped the engine. Without taking his eyes from the yellow slobber the mountain man was slavering up from the window, Rimmer asked in a voice far too calm to be sane, "What are you doing, David?" "What do you think? I'm trying to unhotwire this damn thing." Rimmer tried to swallow, but his tongue just rasped against his sandpaper palate. "A more prudent approach, one might venture, would be to leave this vehicle in a post-hastely kind of way and run backwards the hell out of here." Lister carried on fiddling with the ignition wires. "Rimmer, I've got to undo this. That's the way things are around here, effect and cause. Every effect is followed by a cause. There's no way around it. We couldn't just waive the rules for once?" "Not rules, Rimmer, laws, immutable cosmic laws. Look, man, just stop interrupting me and try and panic in silence, okay?" The engine churned, spluttered and stopped. The hillbilly finally stopped thumping, cursing and slobbering and moved away. Rimmer peered over the edge of his window and watched the hermit, clutching his shotgun, racing bandily backwards towards a pathetic log cabin. Rimmer could quite clearly see a giant sow sitting in a swing chair on the wooden porch. The hermit appeared to have dressed the pig in a pink gingham dress and varnished its hooves with bright red nail polish. Rimmer really didn't want to know why. The engine churned again and died. Rimmer found in his soul a new level of loathing for Lister. Valiantly and selflessly he'd risked life and limb to land on this hellhole to rescue his shipmate, and how had the scumbag repaid him? By leading him into a series of life-threatening situations, culminating in his being unshot at and de-slobbered over by a giant pig's husband who was almost certainly related to himself in a variety of illegal ways. The engine chuddered one last time, and Lister seemed satisfied. "That's it," he said. "We're out of here," then leaned over and thrust open Rimmer's door. Rimmer glanced over at the cabin. The hillbilly had stashed his shotgun by the door and was herring off backwards up towards some thick woods behind them. "Come on," Lister was yelling. "Move it!" Lister jumped out of the driver's seat and started poking at the door lock with a rusty nail that had leapt into his hand from the track. "What now?" Rimmer whined. "Reckon he must keep it locked." Rimmer looked over at the woods the hillbilly had vanished into. Why on Io would the trigger-happy pork poker bother locking his car up here in this godforsaken wilderness? "Search me," Lister heard the click as the lock connected. "Maybe he doesn't want the pig driving off in it." Well, that made sense to Rimmer. From what he'd seen of the mountain man, the pig was undoubtedly the brains of the business. Lister wiggled the nail out of the lock and placed it in the dirt beside the car. He straightened. "All right, it's leg it time." Rimmer asked, "Which way?" even though he was fairly sure he could guess the answer. Lister nodded towards the woods. "I reckon he was chasing us, don't you?" He turned to Kryton, who was conversing in forward speak with the cat. "How is he?" "He'll be fine, sir, so long as we stay together. Apparently he had an unpleasant experience in some bushes a while back when we left him alone." Lister wiped the palm of his hand across his face. "I can guess. We should have warned him." "OK, people, wagons roll." He performed his familiar reverse skid and took off for the trees. Kryton turned around and followed him, backwards. Rimmer and the cat looked at each other and mutely voted to flout convention. They ran towards the woods, forwards. The cat kept yelling, "On my head!" as his inverted slipstream continually whipped his pigtail over his cheeks and eyes. He reached behind his head and grabbed it, keeping his other arm needlessly cocked in front of him to protect his face from branches which he had absolutely no faith would continue to yield a path for him just before he reached them. Rimmer and the cat burst through a thick bush to find Lister and Kryton crouched behind a bank of fern which looked up onto a hillside cave. Rimmer's heart jumped up and shook hands with his Adam's apple when he recognized it as the cave they'd concealed Starbug in. The broad, twisted grin of delight slowly trickled back down from his cheeks when he saw that Lister was frowning and chewing the inside of his lip. "What's up?" he whispered. "We're home." "Not quite," Lister hissed. Rimmer followed his gaze. In the clearing before them, a bizarre, jerry-built concoction of vats, tubes and pipes was sucking in smoke from the tree line above. "What is it?" Kryton answered. "I would guess some kind of illegal still." Not for the first time, Rimmer doubted the sanity of the lawmakers of Reverse Earth. What in heaven's name could possibly be illegal about taking dangerous alcoholic liquor and converting it into grain for planting? Then he saw it. Just below a small blue flame which was sucking the heat out of some bubbling liquid in a vat, a rubber tube led to a fuel canister. The canister was imprinted with a Jupiter Mining Corporation logo and stamped Red Dwarf. This time, Rimmer's heart plunged towards the pit of his stomach, and his testicles leapt up to meet it. The hillbilly had found Starbug. There were lots of things Kryton was trying not to think about. He was trying not to think about how they had now less than 7 hours before their takeoff window closed, leaving them stranded in this reverse universe. He was trying not to think about just how much of Starbug had been pillaged by the Mountain Man, and whether or not the vessel would still be capable of flight. He was trying not to think about how he was going to explain the severity of their plight to the others. The hillbilly had unspotted Lister just as they leapt behind the bank of ferns, and was now prodding around the undergrowth on the other side of the clearing. His shoulders were heaving, and he was sobbing loudly. Thick streams of wetness crawled up his cheeks from his damp beard into his nose and eyes. Finally, he backed into a thicket just by the still, and he was gone. Right. Rimmer glanced around, trying to decide who should bear the brunt of his reproachful look, and settled on Kryton. "Just how bad is this?" "It's not good, sir. Those spare fuel tanks are stored in the hold. We must conclude that the entire ship has been compromised, including the computer systems and engine rooms." Rimmer shook his head. "Marvelous," he said. "We don't even have the technology to keep out a bandy-legged, brain-dead hillbilly with a gene pool no bigger than a spider's piss puddle." They picked their way carefully up the sloping ridge to the cave's entrance. The undawning sun was glimmering dangerously low, just over a distant white-capped peak, and while Kryton and the cat had excellent low-light vision, Lister and Rimmer were beginning to have difficulty seeing. Once inside the mouth of the cave, Kryton was forced to activate his chest light. Lister felt his chest tighten with excitement as the beam fell on Starbug's cockpit. He hadn't seen the dirty green insect-shaped ship-to-surface vessel in 3 decades, but he'd dreamt of it plenty. It had become an icon to him, his ticket home. Wordlessly, Kryton emitted the access signal, and the doors swung open. Hydraulics hissed, and the landing ramp dropped smoothly down. No one dared speak, but everyone was thinking, so far, so good. They climbed inside. Kryton activated the airlock, the steps retracted, and the outer door clanged shut. After an unbearable pause, the inner door opened, and they stepped into the midsection. It was just as they'd left it. Kryton walked straight up the 4 steps into the cockpit section as the drive lights flickered on and started running system checks. The cat headed straight up the stairs, which led from the midsection to the rest quarters above, presumably to check no one had been screwing around with his clothes, while Rimmer made for the maintenance corridor to glance around the engine rooms and investigate the supplies. All Lister could do was sit. He thumped down into one of the chairs surrounding the scanner table and looked around the room. Above the girder grid of the midsection ceiling, the lights appeared to flare. Lister put his hand to his eyes and it came away wet. He looked down at the floor where small droplets began to form from a damp patch there and started whipping up towards his face. Shamelessly, Lister unwept. 36 years ago, in his own universe, Lister had died. His shipmates had brought him to this place where time's reversal could bring him back to life, and he'd lived that life, and he'd been grateful for it. But all the while, he felt he was an outsider here. There had been joys, of course. Somehow his long-dead ex-lover, Chrissy Kachansky, had been brought here with him, and they'd shared the pleasures of growing younger together. Eventually their twin sons had come home to live with them, and there had been the inverted delight of watching them demature. But all that had long since passed. Almost a decade had gone by since the boys had been pushed back into their mother, and 9 years ago he and Chrissy had been introduced, whereupon she'd promptly gone away and forgotten him. And after that, the only thing that kept him sane had been the dream of this moment. Here, now, sitting in Starbug's familiar, unhomely, metallic surroundings. For Lister, there was no more glorious decor in the history of interior design. The last of the teardrops rolled up his face, leaving only fading red rims around his eyes, as the cat skipped down the metal stairway, grinning as if there was a wedge of Edam lodged between his cheeks.
Yes,
he beamed. Rimmer ducked in through the hatch from the engine rooms. What was that? Lister looked up. He hadn't used forward speak for decades, but he ought to start practicing. He ran the cat's words over in his head. Suddenly they clicked. I think, he said, we can relax. My suits are safe. Excellent news, Rimmer favoured the cat with the grin he reserved for idiots and foreigners. I, for one, shall sleep soundly tonight. Well, he rubbed his hands together. Supplies are good, just the one fuel canister missing. Engines seem operational. Computers are functioning. Looks like we can lift off. Kryton stepped down from the cockpit. The others turned their eyes towards him expectantly. I, he began, then slammed his forehead against the hull's interior. I'm afraid there is one minor problem. Somehow the landing jets have become detached. There was a brief moment of silence, then Lister suddenly cursed, Smeg, and kicked the body of the scanner table, neatly removing a dent that had been there. It's not that bad, people, Rimmer smiled encouragement. We don't have to land. Once we RV with Red Dwarf, one of us can jet back over and tow Starbug in, yes? You don't understand. Kryton sank into the seat opposite Lister. When we sat down here, I had to reverse the controls. The only way of bringing us down was to use the takeoff procedures. Rimmer was still baffled. So? So, Lister said, we need the landing jets to take off. Without them, we'll be stuck here. He looked between his feet where the damp patch had been. We'll be stuck here forever. The four of them stood under the bulge of Starbug's belly. Kryton's light angled directly at the alarming space where the retrojets ought to have been. All three of them were missing. It doesn't make sense, Rimmer ran his hands through his wiry hair. Why would Jethro Clampett's stupider brother want 3 landing jets from a space vehicle? What's he going to do? Launch his cabin into orbit and join the Mile High Club with his pig? Perhaps he's not the one responsible, Kryton offered. Look. He directed the beam at the severed retainers which had been welded to the engine. The metal exposed there was rusted over. Kryton's list of things he didn't want to think about was growing to novella proportions. All right, Rimmer walked back to Starbug's rear. Couldn't we rig up one of the main thrusters underneath so it could act as a landing jet? It might work, Kryton agreed, if we had time. Unfortunately, we're relying on certain planetary conditions to help us slingshot out of the solar system. Those conditions will not be fulfilled unless we leave soon. Well, how soon is soon? 5.5 hours. Lister blew like there was a tuba missing from his lips. That's soon. Okay, we've got just one shot. Find those engines. How long would it take to attach them? Kryton looked at the ground and shook his head. There is no way of knowing. It would depend on what condition they're in. At least 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. Lister looked at his watch. That gives us till 2 a.m., 1:30 at a pinch. We're going to have to split into 2 groups. I'm no good in the dark, neither's Rimmer. I'd best go with the cat. Come what may, we meet back here at 1:30. Kryton was on the last leg of his search pattern and less than 10 minutes away from engaging panic like a headless chicken mode when he found the first of the engines. He wouldn't have spotted it at all if he hadn't actually tripped up over it. It was buried deep in the soil, less than 50 yards from the illegal still, just a few inches of the nosecomb peeking above the ground. Kryton knelt down and frantically clawed away the surface soil while Rimmer kept a timid lookout, trying not to think of the strange night creatures that might be lurking in the damp, dark shadows of the trees. Kryton exposed a further foot or so of the engine. The excitement of his discovery dwindled with each inch. The engine was rusted all to hell. He was extremely doubtful it could ever be restored to working condition. He lurched upright and sighed. Well? Rimmer's eyebrows crooked with expectation. It's no good, sir. It's buried too deep. We need some kind of digging tool. I'll get one from Starbug. Suggest you stay here. He turned and prepared to switch up to maximum jog mode. Whoa, 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 Rimmer smiled. Are you insane? I'm coming with you. I'll make much better time on my own, sir. Rimmer peered into the relentless gloom of the surrounding woods. He thought of mountain lions and grizzly bears. He thought of wolf packs and cougars. He thought of werewolves and Sasquatch and inbred hillbillies with guns and seriously dubious sexual preferences. He thought of all the wild things with yellow eyes and an insatiable bloodlust that would swallow his light bee whole as a pre-hors d'oeuvre canapé without even making a gulping noise. We'll go together, he said. Very well. Kryton nodded, then turned, lurched, and pelted off at maximum acceleration, leaving Rimmer wide-eyed, alone, and furious. Kryton didn't get very far. As he burst through the thicket into the clearing that housed the still, his peripheral vision registered a pickaxe handle, and he stopped. He underestimated his speed and stopped too quickly, losing his balance and tumbling to the ground. He put out his hands to break his fall, plunging them into a wooden bucket filled with rainwater. When he pulled them out, he was alarmed to find they were covered in some sort of sticky goo. He considered trying to wash them, then realized that that wouldn't work. In this universe, you use water to get yourself dirty. He picked himself up and waddled over to the pickaxe handle. It was protruding from a clump of bushes. He grabbed it with his sticky hands and readied himself to tug it free. He looked down and froze. Lying in the bushes beneath him was the lifeless body of the hermit. The pickaxe was buried deep in his chest. Kryton knelt and placed his fingertips on the hillbilly's neck. There was no pulse. The body was still fairly warm. Fresh blood was still oozing around the terrible chest wound. He eased back onto his haunches and tried to think. How could the hermit possibly be dead? Time was running backwards, and they'd already seen the man alive later that morning. Kryton accessed the unshooting incident in his visual storage and selected a still frame of the hillbilly. He looked down at the dead man and compared the two faces. It wasn't the same man. He was dressed the same, and his features were extremely similar, but not exactly the same. Undoubtedly, the corpse was a close blood relative of the hermit who'd shot at them. The preceding events began to tumble into place. That's why the mountain man had been weeping in the clearing. He'd discovered his brother's corpse. He'd been beating the bushes looking for some kind of clue to the perpetrator of the crime. Then he'd spotted Lister and chased them to the car. He'd assumed they were the killers. This was the crime for which Lister had been arrested. And since Lister couldn't have killed the man, that meant the real murderer was somewhere close by. Suddenly, Kryton was aware of someone behind him. There had been no footsteps, just the slight rustle of breathing. Kryton wheeled round, his hands flattened and elbows cocked in what he hoped would look like a threatening karate pose to his attacker. It was Rimmer. His eyes tracked down the pickaxe handle to the corpse, then back up to" Dead? He asked simply. "I'm afraid so. It's not the hermit who was chasing us. I think it's probably his brother or his cousin. Probably both, Rimmer knelt beside him. Probably his uncle and his father, too. Kryton was affronted. Revulsion at human death was deep in the core of his programming, especially when the death was unnatural and violent. Do you really think it appropriate to jest at the expense of the dead? Rimmer shrugged. He won't be dead long. Of course. Kryton cursed his own stupidity. Soon, probably in a matter of minutes, the corpse would come to life. All they had to do was conceal themselves in the bushes and wait until the murderer showed up. Suddenly the corpse's eyes blinked open, startling Kryton so violently he lost his balance again and tumbled onto his back. The corpse opened its mouth and let out a terrible death rattle. Kryton scrambled to his feet. "For God's sake," Rimmer yelled, "turn your smegging light on!" Kryton flicked on his chest light. The beam hit the animating corpse. It gurgled as a thick dribble of bubbling blood trickled up its cheek and into its mouth. Dizzy with horror, Kryton was vaguely aware that Rimmer was talking to him. He turned and said, "What?" "Your hands," Rimmer was saying. He held his hands in the light. The goo that covered them was blood. With a low, awful moan, the corpse began to writhe. Its body started juddering violently. Then it arched its back stiffly and screamed. It thumped back down and began beating the ground with its fists. It screamed again in pain and fury and grasped the pickaxe handle. It started rocking from side to side, hands desperately clawing the handle of the instrument of its death. Rimmer was screaming, "Do something!" And Kryton staggered forward, half blind with panic. He grasped the pickaxe. The corpse was looking up at him with an expression that looked like astonishment. Kryton tugged at the handle. There was a wet, cracking sound in the man's chest, but the pickaxe remained lodged there. Kryton summoned all his strength and pulled again, and the corpse was tugged to its feet, arms flailing, screaming and yelling insanely, and still the pickaxe was wedged in his chest. And Kryton held onto the handle, the last of his sanity gurgling out of his ears as he danced a macabre waltz with the dying man in the eerie glow of his own chest light. Kryton was trying to yank the pickaxe loose, but the mountain man was holding it in his own chest with phenomenal adrenal strength. Then suddenly he let go, and with a gruesome crunching gloop, Kryton jerked the pickaxe free. While he was staring, astonished at the hillbilly's unblemished shirt front, the man lunged at the pickaxe still raised over Kryton's head. Still in shock, Kryton tussled with him for a second or two, then let go. The reverse impetus of the maneuver flung him to the ground and sent him rolling side over side towards the bushes. For a moment the hillbilly held the pickaxe over his head, then swung it down towards the tumbling Kryton, but missed and raised it again. Kryton rolled over the spot where the blade had struck and stopped rolling. He jumped to his feet and faced the mountain man, who was brandishing the pickaxe, one hand on the handle, the other halfway along the shaft. He was snarling and murmuring vicious threats. Kryton was hurt and confused. He'd just brought this man back from the dead. Why was he bent on hurting him? The hillbilly hefted the pickaxe into one hand and swung it sideways, but he was out of range, and the blade whistled past Kryton's groinal socket. Kryton stumbled backwards towards the still, not knowing what to do or say. He looked around for Rimmer, but he was nowhere in sight. Then, as Kryton passed the still, it occurred to him to switch off his chest light. Now the clearing was only illuminated by the gentle blue glow of the flame from the still. The mountain man leered dangerously at his retreating form, then swung round and buried the pickaxe in the ground. Facing away from Kryton, he backed up towards the still, looked at Kryton once over his shoulder, and promptly proceeded to ignore him. Kryton backed out of the clearing stealthily and collapsed onto his haunches in the shelter of the nearest bush. After a few minutes, his sanity returned, and Rimmer crept along after it. "Sorry about that," Rimmer crawled close enough to whisper. "Thought I spotted the other one trying to outflank you, so I dashed off to cover your ear." He peered through the bushes. The hillbilly was quietly tending the still. "What now?" "Now?" Kryton had lost track of time. He checked his internal chronometer. Almost 2:15. "We'd better get back to Starbug, see if the others are there." If Lister and the cat had managed to unearth the other two engines intact, it might be enough to get them airborne. Rimmer nodded and turned towards the ridge. Kryton rose to follow him, then stopped him mid-crouch. A terrible thought had struck him. He'd been reversing the incident in his mind in order to explain to the others what had actually happened and why they'd been delayed, when he realized the unthinkable truth. He had just violated his most sacred directive. He had killed a human being in cold blood. Lister was feeling pretty good. He hadn't slept for a good 50 hours now, what with the all-night interrogation at the police station which had uncracked 6 of his ribs and lifted the chronic pain in his kidneys. Each passing hour left him feeling fresher, stronger, and more alert. The engine was surprisingly light, 7 feet long and mostly solid metal, yet he and the cat could carry it between them fairly easily. It was also surprisingly rusty. Still, they'd managed to find it, and if Kryton and Rimmer had enjoyed any luck at all, they'd probably have enough power for a shaky takeoff. He checked his watch. 1:24. They were way behind schedule. Lister pushed the engine from the rear. The cat got the message and upped his speed. They jogged through the clearing and climbed up the ridge to the cave. They set down the engine underneath Starbug's belly. Lister's hopes took a Trafalgar-sized broadside when he saw the rest of the jets were still missing. Rimmer crept down the landing ramp and peered into the gloom beneath the ship. "Lister!" he hissed timidly. Lister ducked under the ramp. "No luck?" Rimmer shook his head. "How did you get on?" "We found one in the hillbilly's grain store. He'd been using it as a shelf prop. It's not in superb nick, but I reckon it'll go. The question is, will one jet be enough? Maybe, if we angle the front retros down, like I said, it'll be touch and go whether or not we clear the mountain, but I don't see what choice we've got." Lister checked his watch. 1 hour and 12 minutes? Let's get moving. Where's Kryton? "I think you're going to have to fix the jet on without him." "Why? What's wrong with Kryton?" Rimmer hitched his eyebrows enigmatically and walked back up the ramp. Lister nodded to the cat and followed him. Kryton was lying on the scanner table, his eyes open and rolled back into his skull. There was a strange buzzing sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere inside his head. "He's been like this since we got back," Rimmer said, "just lying there in some sort of electronic stupor." Lister put his nose to Kryton's ear and sniffed. "Smeg. Smells like something's melted in there." Rimmer nodded. "I think it's some kind of short circuit. Probably happened in the fight." "Fight?" "We found another hillbilly by the still. He had a pickaxe buried in his chest. Kryton pulled it out." "Pulled it out?" "Then they struggled a bit, and it was all over. We stagger back to Starbug. He lies on the scanner table, fizz-bang, there's smoke pouring out of his ears." "Let me get this straight. Kryton pulled a pickaxe out of a man's chest?" "He had no choice. The poor bastard was writhing around in agony." Lister released a sigh that had been pent up inside him for 8 long years. Every single day of his unspeakable imprisonment, he'd yearned to know just one thing. Had he actually committed the crime? All the other inmates had the solace of knowing whether or not they were truly innocent or guilty. Whatever they proclaimed to the world, deep down, they all knew the truth. And through those long, restless nights, it had seemed to Lister that his situation would have been immeasurably more bearable if only he'd known the truth. Time after time he pored over the transcripts of his trial without finding enlightenment. The evidence had been circumstantial. He'd been spotted leaving the scene with another man. From the descriptions, Lister had guessed the second man had been the cat. Lister's inability to disclose the cat's whereabouts had counted heavily against him in the jury's eyes. He'd been sentenced to 15 years, of which he would serve 8. Well, now he knew. He had been innocent. And it didn't make him feel any better, not one quark. The murderer had been Kryton. Lister crossed to the tool store, ripped open the metal cabinet door and started rooting through a box. "I think I know what's wrong with him. Something he did tripped his auto shutdown mechanism." "Can you fix it?" Lister hefted a sonic screwdriver from the toolbox and walked back to the scanner table. "I've done it before, remember?" He eased a tie lever into Kryton's head and prized away a section of the skull. "Question is, can I do it in time?" 12:15 a.m. Kryton should have been concentrating on meeting the flight window deadline, which wasn't exactly midnight, but close enough not to matter a spit. If they weren't airborne before 10 to, well, the alternative didn't bear thinking about. The trouble was, Kryton wasn't thinking about it. He was standing on an elevated platform, holding the part-corroded engine in position, while Lister's laser torch sprayed showers of dancing sparks over him and everything else in the vicinity. Rimmer was pacing nervously beneath them, barking pointless and panicky commands. The cat stood on the bottom step of the mini-crane, shouting equally pointless and panicky commands, only forwards. And Kryton didn't even notice them, nor did he share their panic. He was thinking about murder. Kryton was a murderer, and he couldn't live with it. By the time Kryton had been created, all artificial intelligence life forms were programmed to protect human life. There had been some earlier mistakes, most notably the part-organic agonoids, who had been designed as super warriors and then got a few ideas of their own about obeying orders, and almost rid an entire planet of its human occupants, before the designers wised up and started programming a version of Asimov's robotic laws into the core of every computer mind. Kryton had broken those laws, and his urge to self-destruct was almost unbearable. And so he decided that once the engine was fixed into place and the takeoff prepared, he would slip quietly down the ramp and disappear into the cave. He was incapable of thinking clearly and had no idea how he might commit suicide on a planet where time was running in reverse. All he knew was that he was unfit to share the company of humans. If that meant spending an eternity alone in the dark recesses of inaccessible caverns with only his guilt and his pain for company, then so be it. He'd discharge this final duty and be gone. Suddenly, he was aware of silence. Lister flicked off his torch, raised his welding mask, and looked up at the awkwardly angled landing jet. "It's not perfect. Should be enough to give us a shot." He tugged off his gloves and started climbing down the mini-crane steps towards the cat's anxious stare. It had been a tricky job trying to attach the jet using a cutting tool, and Kryton had been precious little help. Lister had no idea how long it would hold, if at all. He'd been alarmed by his close examination of Starbug's underside. A lot of the plate seemed to have been recently welded into place, and there appeared to be a dangerous level of corrosion under the fresh metal sheets. Still, with less than 5 minutes to go, he decided not to share his fears with the others. Either Starbug would get off the ground, or it wouldn't. No point in complicating matters now. As the cat hurriedly loaded the mini-crane back inside, Rimmer pointlessly urging him on with backwards barked commands, Lister discreetly shone the work lamp over the walls of the cave. As he'd suspected, the walls were latticed with ruts, some fresh with scorch marks, others filmed over with grime. Some part of him probably knew the truth then, but it wasn't about to go and blurt it out to the rest of him. There could be dozens of explanations for the presence of those marks, none of them feasible or likely, but all of them better than the probable truth. A wisp of undispersing smoke wafted across the beam. He sniffed the air. The familiar fumes of part-burned jet fuel were starting to build up. He took a last look around the cave, and then pounded up the landing ramp. He was inside the cockpit before the ramp had fully retracted. Rimmer was seated towards the rear of the cockpit, running checks over the navicomp. The cat was in the pilot's seat, which took Lister somewhat by surprise, but on reflection it made sense. The cat had faster reactions and better directional sense than the rest of them put together. True, he was also stupider and vainer than the rest of them put together, but in a pinch, the best choice for the job. Lister was about to slip into the co-pilot seat beside him when he realized that Kryton's computer station was unmanned. "Where's Kryton?" The cat shrugged. Rimmer didn't take his eyes off the navicomp and said, "He's running some checks in the engine rooms." Lister punched up the security cameras and scanned the engine rooms. Deserted. Kryton was not on board. His eyes still on the navicomp display, Rimmer said, 90 seconds and counting." "Whoa!" Lister formed his hands into a capital T. "Time out, guys. Kryton's still out there." "Lister, we are about to perform what is probably the most complicated reverse landing takeoff procedure ever attempted in the history of aviation, with a single landing jet which is rustier than Elizabeth I's chastity belt. Furthermore, the pilot and I do not even speak the same language in the same direction, and even if we did, we wouldn't agree. We do not need any more complications. Complications? Kryton's not on board. We can't leave without him. Wrong. We can't leave with him. If we abort now, we miss the flight window. Then we miss it. We're not abandoning Kryton. 60 seconds and counting. Rimmer flicked his eyes up from the screen. He knows what he's doing. He's made his choice. The flight path's been logged in and we can make it without him. What do you mean, he's made his choice? You mean he told you he wasn't coming with us? Well, what he actually said was, I'm going for a walk, I may be some time. And you let him go? Rimmer looked down at the screen again. 45 seconds. Lister jumped back down to the midsection and raced to the airlock. As he slid his palm over the security scanner, the engines began to whine. The scanner readout flashed red, and a warning panel blinked the words, Airlock inaccessible until landing procedure complete. Lister thumped the scanner with his forehead and charged back to the cockpit. Starbug began to shake as the engine whine built. Lister staggered to the co-pilot station and yelled to the cat, Stop! Stop! The cat looked up at him confused, then over at Rimmer, who shook his head and said, 0. Starbug juddered as the engines crescendoed and Lister was flung into the co-pilot's seat. No! He screamed. No! He flicked on the external cameras. The cave outside was almost completely obscured by the fog banks of thick black-brown smoke that the single landing jet was labouring to inhale. Just for an instant, he thought he caught a glimpse of Kryton's too-pink face craning to see them through the acrid fog. The cockpit was juddering wildly now. A jumble of flight manuals leapt from the floor around Kryton's deserted station and arranged themselves neatly on a shelf. And they were airborne. The combination of Retro's roaring, the landing jet screaming, and the jittering vibration rocking the cabin made communication virtually impossible. Lister lunged forward and flicked at the abort switches on the co-pilot's control panel. Useless unless the pilot initiated the abort sequence too. He looked over at the cat, hoping he would copy the maneuver. The cat ignored him. Lister lurched out of his seat and reached over for the pilot abort controls, but Starbug pitched again suddenly, and his hand crashed into the wrong bank of switches. Starbug began to spin. Inside the cockpit, the alert lights started flashing wildly, and the sirens sucked in a gua wail, added to the bedlamic confusion. Outside, in the choking gloom of the cave, Kryton watched with mounting horror as Starbug span hopelessly out of control. The cavern around him was just an explosion of jet thunder as unsynchronized blasts from the front retros sucked scorch marks from the cave walls and neatly packed the long, deep ruts beneath full of stone. Desperate to do something, anything, to help them, Kryton ran towards the stricken, spinning craft and leapt. His fingertips gripped the landing leg's splayed foot, and he hung on grimly. Big mistake. His weight and momentum tilted the vessel even further off kilter, and its spin became wilder and more unstable. It pitched and rolled like a desperate gyroscope without enough force to regain its centre. Kryton clung there, not knowing what to do. In his panic, he'd worsened the situation, but if he let go now, Starbug might topple radically over in the opposite direction and smash into the deadly rock, perhaps even turn over completely. What had he been thinking of? Had some part of his guilt-crazed mind thought he could tug the ship safely to the ground? Who did he think he was, an expatriate of the planet Kryton? He tried to make the best of it by trying to gauge the spin and swinging his body against it. As he pendulumed gently to and fro underneath the crazily twisting spacecraft, he tried to persuade himself he was making some small difference, but he wasn't very convincing. Inside the cockpit, insanity reigned. The cat's emergency procedure of hitting every button in reach was not contributing massively to the restoration of calm. The seats were all jumping up and down on their hydraulics, computer slugs were pinging across the cabin and popping into their drives, lights were flashing crazily, and military band music was blasting from every speaker in the ship at ear-bleeding volume. Lister lurched across the cat and jabbed wildly at the abort panel. A lucky flick killed the retros and the spin began to slow. The cat regained control of the collective, brought the vessel horizontal, and closed down the landing jets. With the smallest of small bumps, Starbug nestled back down on the cave floor. The cat leaned forward, flicked off the band music and grinned at Lister. "The worms," he said. Lister shook his head and checked the external camera. The cave was empty of smoke, but Kryton was nowhere in sight. Where the smeg had he gone? Had they landed on him? Lister shot out of the cockpit and raced to the airlock. He ran his palm over the scanner again, and once again it flashed red. The hell was wrong now? He glanced over at the warning panel, which was blinking occupied. The inner wheel span and the airlock door clicked open. Kryton was standing in front of him, his plastic face twisted in fear and concern. "Sir, are you all right?" Lister's relief at seeing Kryton safe instantly gave way to a sense of desperation and failure. "Yeah," he mumbled without enthusiasm. "We're fine, Kryton." Cat slinked down from the cockpit and Rimmer followed him. Kryton felt so grateful to see them intact he felt like spontaneously combusting. "Oh, sirs, this is all my fault." "No, it's Lister's fault," Rimmer glared. "He was acting like one of those little Scottish blokes in POW movies who suddenly go stir-crazy and make a beeline for the electric fence." "It's nobody's fault, Kryton," Lister said without looking up. "It just happened, okay?" "Not okay." Rimmer strode over to him. "Have you seen the time?" Lister nodded. 11:42. Which means, unless my backwards arithmetic is seriously askew, that we have missed our flight window, yes? Lister nodded again. "Believe me, Rimmer, it's the last thing I wanted. I've already been stuck here for 30-odd years. Rimmer straightened. Blame had been apportioned, and none of it had fallen on him, and he was beginning to feel better already. "All right, then," he smiled. "Let's talk damage limitation." He turned to Kryton and said, "There's absolutely no chance that we can attempt another reverse landing and achieve this flight window?" "I'm afraid not, sir." Rimmer flicked his eyes briefly over to Lister, just in case anyone was in any doubt about the blame quotient, then back to Kryton. "Well, that's too bad, but we're stuck with it, I suppose. The question now is, when is the next flight window?" Kryton squirmed. "Well, I haven't exactly rechecked all of the calculations as yet." Rimmer smiled. "All we need for the moment, Kryton, is your best guess." "Well, sir, I'd be reluctant to commit myself at this stage to a definite time and date." "Kryton, let me put it another way. Just how long are we going to be stuck here on this hellhole, you oversized ugly dildo?" Kryton stammered. "4 hours? 4 weeks? 4 months? Kryton thumped his head against the airlock door. 10 years.